Charles, I'm reading your wonderful book, Star Spangled Crown. In it,
Thank you.
you mention the Courtyard Speech affair in Sweden in 1914 and the Easter controversy of 1924 in Denmark. You also mention the reserve powers of the Governor Generals of Canada and South Africa being employed in 1926 and 1939, respectively. Can you please give more details on these incidents?
I sure can.
All right. Brian, another question from Brian. Charles, you also mentioned that monarchs had. Oh, wait. Why are you laughing?
I don't know. It's
Okay.
just one of those things.
Right. Charles, you also mentioned that monarchs had specific liturgical roles.
I will tell.
Oh, okay. Sorry. All right,
I
go
will
ahead.
tell all.
Give more details on those incidents.
But because I'm able to and
You
stuff.
you are able to, and I command you to do so.
Okay, mouse. It's like that's also my obeisance to my master in Washington. It's like this. In 1914, the war clouds were gathering over Europe, and Sweden was traditionally neutral, but the liberal government of the time were not really keen on doing anything about building up the pathetic state of Swedish defenses. So what happened was that a mob of farmers from all over the country descended on the royal palace in Stockholm, demanding to see the king and to share with them their concerns about Sweden's lack of military preparedness. So the king came out to see his people, and he said, "You're absolutely right. This is a terrible situation, and I will speak to the government about it, about doing something about it. This is a very bad situation we're in." Well, oh, were the politicians upset sets. The poor little dears. How dare the king have an opinion of his own? How dare he listen to the people without having it filtered through the politicians? Oh, gee willikers, I could just spit. That was truly not only the reaction of the worthless Swedish politicians of the time, almost every account of it down to the present that comes from official sources has the same. This was the terrible breach of constitutional protocol. Oh, I mean, my gosh. And mind you, this was simply a question of the king not actually doing anything, but making the farmers' wishes known to their alleged servants, the politicians. But they were so upset. Oh, it's just terrible. Oh, terrible, terrible, terrible. Well, similarly, the Easter controversy of 1924 occurred across the strait there in Denmark. Christian X was the king of Denmark, and about less than 20 years after our story, he would prove his incredible bravery in the face of the Nazi occupation of Denmark. Christian X was an extremely heroic and brave man. But of course, there were always the little politicians, the termite people, to deal with. And what happened basically was that in the wake of World War One, southern Schleswig, which had been seized from Denmark by the Prussians and Austrians in 1864, was returned after a plebiscite to Denmark. But there was, I don't remember the exact details. What I do remember is that the method of Schleswig being reincorporated led to a fight between the king and the ministry. And the ministry resigned, and there was a great deal of upsets and blah, 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 because the king had dared to have an opinion of his own. But again, although I don't remember the details, I do remember that, as with Gustav V and the Courtyard Speech, at the end of the day, if you examine what happened, so look it up, Easter controversy, don't take my spotty memory, Christian X was right, just the way Gustav V was right, and the worthless politicians of the day were very typical of their worthless, mangy class. And speaking of worthless and mangy, let's go on to the other two examples. Now, I have to explain something about both Canada and Australia. Uh, the Governor General in a country like Canada or Australia, where the country is independent, but the sovereign is the same as the sovereign of Great Britain, uh, the Queen or the King is represented in Australia, in Canada, by a Governor General. Now, today, the Governor General is normally chosen on the advice of the local government, which, as you can imagine, carries a problem with it already. Because if the local government gets a little wild, the Governor General is a person they've had appointed. But there have been three, not two, but three major conflicts between governors general and their supposed governments in the 20th century. The first was in Canada in 1926. Now, one thing that's important to remember that prior to 1931, the Governor General was chosen on the advice of the British government, not the Canadian government. After 1931, the Statute of Westminster, it was chosen on the advice of the Canadian. But in those days, the Governor General was always a British nobleman or soldier. And Lord Byng, who was the Governor General in 1926, had commanded the Canadian troops at the Battle of Vimy Ridge in World War I. So he was a British Army officer, but he was considered very much a hero by a lot of Canadians because of the role he had played, which is why he got the job. So at the time, the Prime Minister of Canada was a very strange and dodgy little man called William Lyons Mackenzie King, who, amongst other things, was also a spiritualist and got a lot of real good advice on the seance table. Now, we shouldn't hold that against him. Our own President Lincoln did the same thing, whose birthday, by the way, was yesterday. So if you live in California and you weren't celebrating Lincoln's birthday, where it's a legal holiday, you're bad. Just thought I'd point that out. What?
Okay, I'm tempted to go on various tangents here, but go on.
Anyway, so it so happened that in 1926, William Lyons Mackenzie King presided over a government that, I don't want to say they were dishonest and full of crooks. Let's just say they were rectitude challenged, ethically challenged.
Okay.
All right. Now, one thing you should understand about the Westminster system that Britain and the Commonwealth realms act under is that the Prime Minister is dependent for a majority on a majority in Parliament. If for whatever reason he loses the majority, he has to go out of office. Now, normally, if he's faced with that, since legally speaking, the Governor General dissolves Parliament and the Governor General calls for elections, normally he does that kind of thing on the advice of the Prime Minister. It's very, very rare, and in fact, we're going to look at the 3 times that it's happened, that he does something on his own initiative. And usually it's done as an emergency measure to prevent something worse from happening. It's also kind of the nuclear option, because if a Governor General does this, if he uses what are called the reserve powers, he's pretty much destroyed his career. So he's only going to do it if the alternative is just horrific. So what happened then was that a royal commission had been appointed by the Prime Minister to look into corruption in the government. Unfortunately, they began finding a lot of stuff. Now, one of the other things about that system of government is that royal commissions like that only last as long as the life of the Parliament that commissions them. So, in other words, if you dissolve Parliament, all the royal commissions that were functioning cease to exist. So, William Lyons Mackenzie King was very fearful, as I say, having a passel of ethically challenged morons in his government. He was very, very worried that this commission would turn up something. So, apropos of nothing at all, he asked the Governor General to dissolve Parliament. Well, the Governor General was all too aware of what William Lyons Mackenzie King was doing. So he turned to the two opposition parties, the Progressive Party and the Conservatives, and asked them if they would form a minority government together long enough to allow the commission to finish its work. And they agreed. So Mackenzie King refused the advice tendered by Lord Byng, rather, the Governor General, refused Mackenzie King's advice to dissolve Parliament. Oh, this was very, very upsetting. Now, fortunately for Mackenzie King and his cohort, the Progressive Party broke the agreement and the government fell anyway. So Lord Byng had to call for new elections. And in the end, Mackenzie King got what he wanted and lived to wreck the country further. So our second of the three Commonwealth examples is the Union of South Africa, which was founded in the wake of the Boer War by the British, who, having defeated the Brits in that war, defeated the Boers, they united their pre-existing colonies of the Cape and Natal, the two border republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. And they set up a federation, a union, as with Canada and Australia. And adding New Zealand, you had 4 of these dominions. South Africa would eventually become a republic in 1961 as part of the Afrikaner nationalist establishment of the apartheid state. And it's been a republic ever since. But at the time of our story, which is 1939, it was a dominion under the crown. The King of South Africa, the King of Great Britain, was the King of South Africa. Now, it so happened that in September of 1939, the king went to war with Germany. Australia and New Zealand, both of which were independent under the Statute of Westminster, declared that they were at war by virtue of the king being at war. Canada, under William Lyons Mackenzie King, the same moron that we dealt with a moment ago, he said, well, we've got to vote for it. For Canada to be at war, we've got to vote for it, which they did. So Canada's at war. The Ireland of De Valera declared that they were neutral. So as King of Ireland, George VI was neutral in World War II. As king of his other dominions, he was at war, but he was neutral as King of Ireland, and in fact continued to sign letters of credence to the German and Italian ambassadors for Ireland. And contrary-wise, the German and Italian ambassadors to Ireland were credited to George VI. So that's one of the fun things about, of course, to be fair, in 1947, he would be at war with himself as King of India and King of Pakistan. So that was kind of hard, fighting himself. It was 49,
being at
rather.
war with yourself, I can imagine that's difficult.
That was 1949. So, what should happen, though, that South Africa had a government under General Hertzog, which was Hertzog was an Afrikaner nationalist and was very much against going to war with Germany. His deputy prime minister, General Jan Smuts, was much more pro-British and very much in favor of going to war alongside the other elements of the empire. So Hertzog went to the Governor General, Sir Patrick Duncan, and asked him to dissolve Parliament, call for new elections, sure that he would get a majority if elections were held. But Jan Smuts went to the Governor General and said, out of the half of my party that support me, plus 2 of the smaller opposition parties that'll join us in a coalition, I can continue as prime minister. I'll have enough seats. And so Sir Patrick refused General Hertzog's advice And Herzog went out of office. The party split, and Smuts became prime minister, and would be prime minister for the next 9 years. So that was the second time. The third happened much more recently in 1975. And this was particularly interesting because the Governor General at the time had been appointed on the advice of the worthless Gough Whitlam, known as Gough Witless to his friends, who's the Labor prime minister, or Liba. We like to say about him that he put the lie into Liba. But Whitlam had Sir John Kerr, that being his name, who's another Australian. He had advised the Queen to appoint him precisely because he was an old Labour man. One of the things that's happened with these viceregal positions in recent years is they've become sort of retirement homes for out-of-it politicians. But Sir John had not really been a politician so much as he'd been a legal fellow. He'd been a judge. So Whitlam presumed that he would go along with anything he told him to. Well, this turned out to be something of a mistake. Because in Australia, unlike Britain or Canada, the two houses of Parliament are almost equal in power in the American style. In Britain and Canada, the upper house is very weak compared to the lower house. But Australia has a Senate that's modeled after the American Senate. So what happened was that Whitlam still had a majority in the lower house, but the upper house refused to vote him supply. That is to say, his budget bill was voted down. Now, normally when that happens, the Prime Minister will ask the Governor General to dissolve Parliament and call for new elections. Because you can't govern without monies being voted to. But Whitlam declared that he was not going to do that, but that he would finance the government through loans and things like that. Now, to understand how this works, ultimately, in the Westminster system, Parliament has the power of the purse. That's why Parliament is sovereign, because it decides where the money's going to go and where it comes from. So to finance government in this extra legal way would destroy the whole spirit of the Constitution. It would be utterly insane. But Whitlam refused to call for new elections. And Sir John begged him to. He said, you really can't do this. He said, yep, I'm going to. I'm absolutely going to. So Sir John realized, after consulting various legal authorities, that he was going to have to do something that had never yet been done. He would have to dismiss the Governor General. Dismiss the Prime Minister. It had never happened in Australian history before. Now, he was faced with a problem. The problem was that the Prime Minister could have the Queen Queen pull the Governor General's commission like that. So if he was going to do this, he had to be very careful as to how he. So he did two things. First, he talked to the head of the opposition, a also worthless fellow named Malcolm Fraser, and he asked him if he would form an opposition government. He would form a caretaker government. Because remember, one of the things that the Governor General has to do is ensure there's a Prime Minister, even if it's just a caretaker. So Fraser said he would go along with it. Then Sir John set things up. He called Whitlam into his office one morning, having prepared the ground the night before, and he said to him, "Are you still resolved to finance the government through extra legal means?" And Whitlam said yes. And Sir John said, "Then I must dismiss you as Prime Minister." the first words out of Gough Whitlam's mouth were, "Where's the phone?" Because he would call Buckingham Palace to get the Queen to yank Sir John's commission before his no longer being Prime Minister would take effect. But Sir John had anticipated that. And he said to him, "You can call Buckingham Palace all you like, but you'll be doing so as a private member of Parliament." He pulled open the drawer and he gave Whitlam the letter of dismissal he'd written the night before, which he had hoped he wouldn't have to use. He said, "You haven't been Prime Minister since last night." And Whitlam was furious. Ooh, politicians are like that. You know, when they get caught out, they get very upset. It's like, have you ever lifted a rock and seen all these little weird things? It's like that when politicians are shown up for what they are. They tend to get very excited the way the things under the rock do. You know, they start burrowing in deeper, or they, or whatever they do. It depends on the politician.
Yeah.
So the lesson to be learned from this, from these 5 examples, is the pitfall of what's called constitutional monarchy. The pitfall is this: the great mythos is that the political class speak for the people. That because you vote for these creatures, their running things is somehow more democratic or better than having the monarch do it. Yet, and this extends not simply to policies in the case of the 2 Scandinavian monarchs, but it refers also to appointment of vice-regal people, like the governors general, or the Canadian provincial lieutenant governors, the Australian state governors, and also to the use of the reserve powers, all these things. The democratic mythos tells us that these should be basically used by the politicians, by the political class, because that means the people are in control. But reality shows us no such thing. The truth is, as with the honor system, you know what honors are? That's the orders and medals that are given out. Under the Westminster system, a very few of them are given out directly by the Queen. But she and the other constitutional monarchs in Europe, they usually give these things out at the behest of the Prime Minister, depending on the order, depending on the decoration. And so every now and then there'll be a scandal that these things are being sold. Can you imagine that a sitting Prime Minister, a politician, would be capable of selling honors? I'm clutching my pearls. This is, who can believe it? Now, the obvious answer to these questions is, let the Queen do it. Let the King do it. Take it out of the hands of the politicians. You see, the same with the appointments of the governors general, etc. You see, we have to have a little reality here. The reality of the situation is that politicians as a class are people who, because of their makeup, their push for power, like artists for their art or athletes for their sport, they're not like normal people. Now, they do things that the rest of us don't know how, can't do. I'm not saying we need to get rid of them, because they fulfill an essential task the way sewer workers do. Where would we be without them? But what needs to be done is to give them real oversight. And unfortunately, an electorate by its nature can't do that. A monarch can. If the monarch has not only the authority to say what ought to be done, but sufficient power to do so. There's a very famous story, which I know I've said on the show before. I don't mind saying it again. Teddy Roosevelt, after he left off being president, came here to Vienna and met Franz Josef, the then emperor. and asked him what he conceived his role to be as a modern 20th century monarch. And his response was, protecting my people from their politicians. And that was exactly what his job was, and that is what he did. It's interesting that in 1914, Parliament had become so contentious in Vienna because of the Czechs and various other things that it was unable to function. So the emperor had to rule by decree, suspended Parliament in hopes that in a few months they could have new elections and then call Parliament back into being. Unfortunately, they had the war instead, so they had to wait until Kaiser Karl came to the throne to get Parliament again. But that really is the job of a modern monarch. And until and unless the majority of people who live in such countries realize that, their systems will continue to go down the tubes as they are going, as the wholly owned playgrounds of a very moronic bunch of people. You know, it always makes me giggle insanely when people talk about inbreeding amongst either royals or Appalachian folk. You've got no idea how inbred in a very real sense our politicians are. You know who Governor Newsom's aunt is?
Pelosi.
Yeah. You know how many people know that?
5.
Well, more than that, maybe 5,000. But it's just not a real present thing. People don't talk about it. You would think the media, in their never-ending search for truth, you would think they'd be all over that, wouldn't you? So that is why constitutional monarchy that's the great flaw of constitutional monarchy as we've come to know it. And that's why you get these grotesqueries like the King of the Belgians refusing to sign an abortion bill, Baudouin he was, and being out of a job for a day so that they could do it themselves. Or the Grand Duke of Luxembourg refusing to sign a euthanasia bill, so the scumbag in power had Parliament vote to take away the power of that power from him. See, the scumbags can't play by the rules. They need total power. And the people are so silly that they think this means an expansion of popular rule. It means no such thing. It means the erosion of the one check on their masters that they had. And I am hoping that if nothing else this past year shows people the reality of the world they live in. Your politicians are your masters. Get real. You're owned. I'm owned. Are we clear?
Crystal.
We know because our masters have excreted it from their little pointed heads. We know that abortion is an absolute necessity, but worship is not. And we know this because our masters from on high say so. You see, as I say, I don't advocate a violent overthrow or shooting these people down like the dogs they are. No. I don't advocate that at all. Because, as I say, they do things that normal people can't or won't do. But they have to be accepted for what they are. Not our servants, but our masters. And so there has to be an effective check on them to smack them around when they need smacking. And the electorate can't do it. We know this. We've seen it.
Okay.
I mean that in a nice way, incidentally.